The reason why I'm so attracted to the breath work is because asana is still a choice. This affects my nervous system in another way. This asana does this asana does that. That's all choice. You don't have any choice with the breath. You're just grabbed by the balls from the first day you're born. You have to breathe. So you're already speaking a pranayama breathwork language just by being alive. You already are breathing. So it catches your most primary, fundamental, hands down champion winner is the breath. You go for a while without food and water, but the breath is royalty. So you have to examine it because it's there. It sustains you. You can't decide not to breathe. And so because of its vital position, I find it the most fascinating and I find it the most effective of any little nuance that I want to shift. If it's in my breathing, it's usually pretty big.
Welcome to Guys Talking Yoga, a podcast created to help men consider the practice of yoga for its many benefits by sharing the stories and the paths of other guys. I'm your host, Derek Vanderwalker, and today's guest is Frank Mauro. Frank was introduced to the basics of Hatha Yoga by his father while growing up in all places, Little Italy, New York. But it wasn't until his mid-20s that Frank began exploring asana postures and the philosophical underpinnings of the practice. Back then in the 1990s, New York was in its heyday of the yoga movement. Dozens and dozens of studios were opening up across the city, giving birth to a whole new generation of conscious and creative yoga teachers, including a young Frank Mauro. In this conversation, we discuss, let's say, the unique beginnings of Frank's relationship with yoga, being a 5-year-old in the shadow of his father's own spiritual journey, and ultimately how the practice of yoga helped Frank deal with some deep anxiety later in life. And he did it with the breath, the immense power and vastness of what connects us to ourselves and the world around us.
I don't know if it's your basic father and son story, but if you want to spend time with your dad, learn what he likes to do because that's what you're going to be doing. If your dad goes fishing or he goes to hang out at the racetrack, tell him you like the racetrack, you'll be going there because this whole thing of dads doing what the kid wants to do is a new thing. When I was a kid, you wanted to stay with your father, you figured out what he liked and you went there. So my dad was a guy from Lower Manhattan in Little Italy, Greenwich Village area. He was kind of atypical. He looked different than everybody in his neighborhood. Everybody was like Brill cream, slick back hair, silk shirts. And my dad looked like Jesus. My dad had a long beard, long hair. He practiced yoga, practiced a lot of breathing techniques. And one of the things I did was go with him to talk to people that were giving him private lessons or advice on breath work or even to talk about the expanse of the universe. And I would be right there listening.
And so you started following him where?
Like if he wanted to go practice yoga or a lot of times just in the house, he would say, I'm going to go do a headstand for 25 minutes. Do you want to join me? And I'd say, sure. And I was about 5, maybe 7, 8, 9. And I would say at about 12 or 13, this immediate embarrassment hit me about my dad. He's got long hair. He practices yoga. Kids are kids. They're going to make a remark like, there's Frank's dad. He's upside down. Or anything that happened that was upside down. Look, just like Frank's father, he's upside down. And I'd be like, I don't want to hear that anymore. It just made me embarrassed. My friends would come over the house.
The interest in hanging out with your dad dropped a little bit.
I'd say like most 12-year-olds, a lot of it, yeah.
How did your dad get into this stuff?
He had a 3-month in the hospital life tragedy. The family calls it an accident to this day. He's like, well, when your father had his accident, I'm like, it was no accident. My father was unintentionally shot.
Wow.
The guy that was supposed to get shot was the guy that was driving the car. My dad was in the passenger seat. Long story, my dad gets shot, loses his eye, stays in the hospital for 3 months, in and out of comas, wasn't sure if he was going to live, gets out of there, and he came out of it asking questions, and it led him right towards stuff. And then you always hear this expression, it fell off a truck. Literally, his cousin, my second cousin, worked a trucking route, and a book that fell off the truck was called The Wisdom of India and China. And it was written by the author. I'll never forget it because the book was big. It was called, the author's name was Lin Yutan. And my father devoured that book. And as did I when I was later on in life. And so that's how he got onto the thing.
So that's pretty wild in and of itself. Let's get back to you. So it's the late 70s. You are realizing that maybe what your dad's doing is not your path, or at least at that point in time. And then you get into the 80s. So how did your path evolve then, and how did it curve back to this stuff?
I had a fair amount of spiritual thoughts as a teen, but not anything to strike a conversation with anybody. And I knew I didn't have confidence in talking to anyone about this stuff that I grew up with. I knew that it's just not going to be put on the table, and it could even affect my status in that tribe. And I do remember talking about spirituality to people in bookstores, like when I would go to the village, when I'd go to like the West Side, and I'd walk into a bookstore at 15, 16 and say, hey, what's this book about? What's that book about? So there was a little bit of interest, but it really wasn't until actually when I was about 19 years old, I started getting panic attacks, and they were pretty severe. They came in within a few months, and then I was just debilitated out of nowhere for months, a long time. By then, my parents were split up, and I went to go stay with my dad for a while to just dry out and get clean, get connected to my head. And I got back into making art. And I said, I think I want to work in the art world. I want to get a job in the art world. I want to show in art galleries. And even if I don't make a lot of money, I want a job around the arts. And that's what I did. That's what I geared myself towards. And I hung out with a lot of artists, and we all were showing at this place. It was like a printing place that you could put up your work. And the woman there that ran it was really cool. And she would send us on fishing trips and stuff. And I think she had a house. I forgot the whole logistics of it, but it was down in North Carolina. And a few of the guys that I went with went on this fishing trip down south, and they started practicing asanas in the morning, like right on the beach. And I looked out, and I heard them leave the house, and like, oh yeah, we didn't want to wake you. We wake up and practice yoga. And I said, I used to do that with my dad when I was like a little kid. Like I could stand on my head. And they were like, really? Can you? Because we can't get the headstand part yet. We're still working on it. We're still practicing it. I was like, that's kind of the only thing I really was interested in, is standing on my head. And I showed them. And it was basically a tripod headstand. It wasn't a bound head. It was Niralamba. It was unsupported. It wasn't Salamba. So I showed them, and they were kind of blown away. They're like, wow. And we're all like 23 years old, 22, something. Maybe might have been a little older, maybe like 24. And I said, where do you learn this? And they said, this place called the Sivananda Yoga Center. And it was on 24th Street, which I think it still is. It's been there since Swami Vishnu Devananda was throwing pamphlets out of Peter Max's airplane on yoga in the 60s. So it's connected to that guy, Vishnu Devananda, actually connected to Swami Shivananda. That's why it's called Sivananda Yoga. And I went back there, and we returned on a Monday. I think I went on a Tuesday night immediately. And I said, I want to try this. I bought a card of classes, like 20 classes. Now hold on to your seat. It's for like $60 or some shit like that. It was cheap. It was just a card. They punched it each time you went. And I couldn't believe how I felt. And I couldn't believe how my anxiety, which, by the way, those anxiety attacks, those panic attacks, would resurface every once in a while.
Do you know what triggered them?
I mean, that might be a whole other long interview, but what would trigger them was stressful situations, I guess. But what made them scary is at that stage of my life, I didn't need stress. Happiness could trigger them. Calmness could trigger them. They would just come about like waves on an ocean. And I would be staying with people, I remember, and saying, I got to leave. Like, wow, we're having such a good time. Yeah, I can't breathe. We're having a barbecue. We're good people. We're all just chilling out. Everyone likes everybody. There's not a bit of hostility in the air. And yet I'd feel completely constricted.
Yeah.
On a side note, as I got older, I started to enjoy the panic attacks more, and I didn't want them to go away. I wanted to learn more from them.
You had an aversion with the panic attacks initially. I want to get away from this. And then at a certain point you said, no, and I want to go face this and go towards it and understand how to live with this. Or how would you put it in your words?
It felt like somebody was screaming at me and I wasn't listening to them. And I just wanted to listen to them then. Like, what do you got to say then? If I can't breathe, if you got me by the balls, what do you got to say? What do you have on your mind that's so important that you got to choke me out? So let's hear it. And I never really came up with any definitive thing, but what it helped me to do is to really sit and listen to what was going on and ask questions about how I felt about things that were 3 or 4 layers under the surface skin.
It's so deep that you're not even conscious of why you are having these attacks, but there's something deep on a unconscious level.
Yeah.
That's making you feel this way. And you wanted to have some understanding of how to identify what that was.
Pretty much, yeah. But that took a while. That happened even after I started practicing yoga. That took like in my early 30s, because having those panic attacks is pretty freaking terrifying. It was debilitating. It cost me intimate relationships. It cost me jobs. It cost me stuff.
I get it.
And, at the time, nobody knew anything about anything. They were called anxiety attacks. They didn't work their way up to panic attacks until Oprah brought them on her show in like the late 80s, early 90s. They were just anxiety attacks when I first got them.
Now there's more of an understanding that there's probably some sort of ego or shadow thing that triggers this stuff, right?
Yeah. At that point in time, collectively among everybody, and at least the way I felt at that time, was way more of a new age attitude, which I think we may have discussed about my take on new age and ancient practices. I've always felt that if you want long-term, slow, progressive, long-lasting, permanent changes, you got to watch permanent whenever you're talking about yoga, but permanent changes. If you're looking for those kinds of changes, a spiritual, ancient practice is going to be more what fits the bill. And it doesn't mean I agree with every practice because it's ancient. That's not the case. But a lot of them are geared toward a person with time, a person with coins to drop into a big piggy bank one at a time, but be persistent. Where new age stuff gets you healed quick, like close your eyes, go into your cave, picture your power hawk coming at you. You now have wings. You no longer have a problem. And that stuff does work, but it's got its limits. I've always said new age stuff is like an EMS ambulance for your emotions, and more ancient practices are like an MD that you're under the care of for a long time. And I think when you get to a certain point of suffering on that level, you start to see that the suffering really isn't even a disorder. The suffering is a path. It's a message. And when you neglect it, it just beeps louder. And we see it as a disorder.
There's a great C.S. Lewis quote, and I'm probably going to destroy the quote, but it's something along the line that God whispers to you, and then eventually God is shouting in your ear when you're not paying attention. If you don't start paying attention to that voice in your ear or that sense in your gut or whatever it is, you ultimately will have to face it. So you might as well face it on your own terms or your own volition.
Yeah, like any other relationship, you have to work on a relationship. When you're with someone romantically, you want to listen to them, you want to be heard by them, you want to get something out of it, and you want to feel like you're putting something into it for them and for the both of you. And it's kind of like that. Like you can't just say, I understand, I listened. That's it. You're in. From that day on, you're in. You're in a relationship now. You got to listen to your gut, and there's no days off. The longer you take off, the louder it screams.
So how did yoga help you really start to get a handle on this stuff? And what do you love about having such a deep yoga practice as a teacher and as a student?
The first thing that I fell in love with was the thing that I'm still most in love with, and that is just the breath awareness alone. I knew anatomically I had 2 lungs. It felt like I had 10 when I walked out of that first yoga class. It was Sivananda Yoga. So for the people that aren't familiar with it, you do a pose and then you do Shavasana. You do a pose and then you do Shavasana. That's the layout. So the level of receptivity is ginormous. And the poses are hard. It's not like sequenced. Like, oh, we're going to work our way up to this. No, you're just doing that thing right now and then you do Shavasana. I couldn't believe how I wasn't breathing for the first 24 years of my life. I couldn't believe that was always there. And I often have this recurring dream that in my small apartment, I open up a door, like a closet door, and there's a whole other large apartment that's like high end, well furnished, spacious, light, everything. It's beautiful. Probably above my taste as well, but it's just beautiful. It's really exquisite and extravagant. And that's what I felt like when I took that first yoga class. I was like, this was in me the whole time. That kind of breathing was there. Like, I didn't buy a new body. I didn't buy lungs for this class. It wasn't like a diving class where I needed to buy apparatus. This was just in me already. And then when I had my first panic attack, it worked. I was in the middle of a panic attack and I just started to breathe a little bit deeper. And I was like, that whole thing lasted only 80 seconds. How is that? Usually these things cripple me for like a half hour or 20 minutes. And then I'm exhausted for the day. That was really the big stick in the spokes that stopped that wheel of anxiety. It really tripped it up. I still had anxiety attacks, panic attacks after that, but even their sheer presence was nowhere near as daunting because now I had something.
You realize you had more control than you realized before. Would you say that it's been just a continuous learning experience with the breath?
Oh, yeah. Some of the biggest blessings are that sometimes it doesn't work. And that's a blessing.
How so?
Because then you get put in a position that you have to start all over again. You have to go back to the foundational elements that got you there. And then you get the gift of seeing those foundational elements in a different light. You start to see the foundation differently. Not so much that you were wrong prior. You just missed it. You missed another wrinkle in the game. You're like, And all of a sudden, this advanced work that you think you were doing now has to change because the foundation is pointing in a different way.
When you say position, literally like in a new asana, or that you could be in a situation that is out of the studio that has caught you off guard, and then you have to go find that breath?
I've always felt like the foundation of any practice, anything. Like I teach a lot in Japan, and I went for a Kyudo class. Kyudo is their archery. And the foundation alone, the rushed version of that foundation could take weeks of like you just picking up the bow and pulling it back, doing that 1,000 times. And then the sensei looks at you and goes, great. See you next week. Like, when am I going to get to shoot an arrow? And it's that foundational. But the reason I bring that up is because it's so layered and so gently cooked, that foundational breath work, that you're pointing the direction of your greater, more elaborate skills to come, right? Like if you have a flare that you're going to shoot off and you want to point it east, that starts at the foundation. There's a reason why you're already building those initial blocks that are facing east or west or north or south. So if you don't pay enough attention to the foundation of any undertaking and you become more skilled and get more elaborate in your skill set, you could be realizing that you're flying a way you never wanted to fly at all because you didn't spend enough time on that foundation. Now your rocket is going in a different direction. So that was always a help when my breathing practices wouldn't work. And I'd have to go back in the beginning. Like, let me feel how it felt. Maybe if I did it this way, which then tells me, well, then what am I trying to do? Where am I going with this? And it would give me really good questions instead of tight-held answers.
How about from a physical standpoint? As you've become more advanced in your practice, or at least more advanced in knowing yourself in your practice, how has the anatomy of breathing and breath work evolved as you've gotten better at doing some of these asanas and also just knowing your body?
Well, firstly, I like the way you put that question. As I got more advanced, because I'm almost allergic to the word advanced. So I love the way you positioned it. You said, as you become more advanced in knowing who you are through this practice, which is perfectly put. That's exactly what I feel like. I feel like I'm a person that's doing a practice, getting to know themselves more, whether it's meditation, pranayama, or asana. And I don't practice nearly as much asana as I used to, but the pranayama and meditation are still pretty much staples. It's not that I don't practice asana, but my days of going to an hour and 40-minute class and then coming home and practicing for the hour because I want to work stuff out, they're pretty far and few in between. But the reason why I'm so attracted to the breath work, was your question, is because asana is still a choice. It doesn't really connect humanity as much. Asana is a thing that you have to see it and choose it. Like, oh, I think I'll move my body in that way. I believe that this body hits my psycho-spiritual centers in a certain way. This affects my nervous system in another way. This asana does this asana does that. That's all choice. You don't have any choice with the breath. You're just grabbed by the balls from the first day you're born. You have to breathe. So you're already speaking a pranayama breathwork language just by being alive. You already are breathing. So it catches your most primary, fundamental, hands down champion winner is the breath. You go for a while without food and water, but the breath is royalty. So you have to examine it because it's there. It sustains you. You can't decide not to breathe. And so because of its vital position, I find it the most fascinating and I find it the most effective of any little nuance that I want to shift. If it's in my breathing, it's usually pretty big.
So Frank, I love that. For those who are listening who may not know what pranayama is, how would you describe it?
So in the yogic understanding of things, prana is not breath. Prana is an energetic force. I'm not a Star Wars guy deeply, but I would say it's the closest thing to the force that you'd see in that movie. Like when a Jedi can use the force or a Sith Lord could use it against something. And
like the chi.
Like the chi. Yeah. So you have this internal force, and the yogis believed that that force was most abundant, although it existed in food and in certain things. It was most abundant in the oxygen that we take in the breath, in the pattern of breathing. I've always seen the inner breath as not a physical thing, but a place where my mind meets my breath, because the breathing, as we all know, is both voluntary and involuntary. It's sympathetic and parasympathetic, meaning I can stop breathing if I want while I tie my shoes. I'm not going to breathe while I tie my shoes. That's my new habit. You know, every day I'm going to get up, tie my shoes, whether it be 2-3 times a day, I'll have to retie them. I'm going to make a habit that people know me, that I'm the guy that doesn't breathe while I tie my shoelaces. Try doing that with your heart. Try doing that with your kidneys. They're not going to filter anything. Your pancreas is not going to convert any insulin. It's not going to do it because you're going to stop it. Generally speaking, let's say that we all know that the breath has two functions. You can breathe purposefully and intentionally, or you could forget about it and it's still going to carry on. And so I believe that the inner breath really is putting your mind in the middle of a breath event. I don't even want to use the word exercise, but a happening. And that inner breath is when you start bridging those connections of sympathetic, parasympathetic, the nervous system in general, because now you are moving energetically around your body. There is an energy. I'm going to quote another teacher, and that's one of my favorite all-time teachers is Richard Freeman. I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, so I don't really know too much about Sanskrit. So for all you Sanskrit scholars out there, and I have a few friends that are, with them included, this is my disclaimer, so don't ball me out on this. But whenever there is an A before a word in Sanskrit, it means the opposite of. Like, for instance, himsa means to hurt or to harm something. Ahimsa means to not harm it. And so yama means to restrain or hold. Maybe not that strongly contain. I don't know. My English is almost as bad as my Sanskrit. But there's an A before that. So prana, but that A at the end of prana is yama. So Richard Freeman talks about that it's actually the freeing up, not the cajoling or the controlling of the breath, but actually freeing up the inner breath.
So Frank, as we look to close here, and imagine you have a studio full of 20 guys who are relative newcomers to yoga. What are 1 or 2 tips that you would give these guys to set them up to start being aware of and able to start working with their breath?
I think the first thing that I would tell anybody and maybe especially a man, because men tend to be very task-oriented. Breath work is definitely more task-oriented than meditation, but for a guy that's never practiced any of those, it's going to be on the same par as like watching grass grow. So they're not going to really be excited by it. So the first thing I would probably say is don't really expect much. Don't expect a big happening. Just do what you're asked to do. If you're asked to hold your breath a certain amount or breathe into a certain capacity, pay attention and think about your breath not becoming more augmented or more dynamic. Think about your attention now growing. It's your attention that you're working out, you're making stronger. It's that receptivity that you're exercising. The breath, because then that would mean that somebody with emphysema can't get something out of breath work, even if they're going to die in 2 days and it doesn't help their lungs at all. They're on a decline. Breath work is deeper than that. The other thing I might tell them, you said a couple of things. Maybe you're a man. So remember that there's a lot of beautiful things about a man, but some of the difficult things about men is that they don't really have too many volume knobs or acceleration and brake knobs on things. They try everything full blast. Try not to do that. Try to hold this thing like a baby.
Well, Frank, it's everything I thought it would be and more. It's great to see you and thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Derek. This was super fun and great questions and just great conversation. So I'm also not surprised.
I look forward to getting back to class in the Upper West, man.
Great, man. Yep, every Thursday night.
You got it.
All right, man.
Hands down, Frank is one of the most soulful guys I've come across yet. Not only do I appreciate his yoga practice and the way he teaches in the Upper West Side, but also how much he appreciates the fundamental elements of life. Now, we keep these interviews short for several reasons, but sometimes I wish we could go longer, particularly when you get into a deep conversation such as this one. My God, I think Frank retelling his dad's journey is a whole other path we could have gone down. Frank, thanks for sharing all that, and I look forward to seeing you soon. And for those who are listening, if you really enjoyed this conversation, remember to subscribe where you listen to your podcasts and drop us some comments and give us some ratings. All that little stuff does help. And lastly, remember to follow us on Instagram at GTY Podcast. Thanks again and talk to you soon.